Okay, good evening, everyone.
Aisle seat and women like the window seat. And I think that's funny.
On behalf of Matt Lindstrom, the director of the McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement of the College of St. Benedict's and St. John's University, it's my pleasure to welcome everybody to the last panel of our residency with Eisele. I am Nick Hayes. For many of you, I assume, do not know who I am, and I'm on the faculty here, professor of history, and I hold the university chair in critical thinking. Let me take a moment to introduce what we're doing here and the panelists, and then move on to a spirited conversation. I guess if we took a long view, everyone, especially to this crowd, and I hope even my students who are here know why we're here. In many respects, we're here because 40 years ago, yesterday, our most famous alum, Gene McCarthy, stunned the nation and came within a handful of votes of defeating Lyndon Johnson. Out of that have come many things, but specifically was the decision following the late senator's death of so many members of our broad community and the senator's fans across the country to create an endowment, to create a center that would recognize his legacy. In the short term, we're here because out of this, we came up with the idea that we would have a scholar in residence for about a week every year. And Al Eisele is our first example of a scholar in residence. We have lost count of what Al has done. I believe he's visited 14 classes, including the theory of teaching football. He has organized, I have lost track, how many public forums. He has dazzled the local press, the St. Cloud Rotarians, and yesterday on midday with Gary Eichten on Minnesota Public Radio, he brought back to life the events of March 12th, 1968. If any of you missed that, check it out on the McCarthy Center's webpage. You can link it up there. I was thinking, in fact, Al has been so active that I would hate to be the next scholar in residence to follow this act. Let me also make just an important point. When these things work well, which this has, there's many people who do not get properly thanked, who have done an enormous amount, and there are two people I want to recognize. One is my friend and colleague, John Taylor, who has consistently, steadfastly done so much to keep this project going. And I have to also thank my secretary and administrative assistant, who unfortunately has childcare tonight, Norma Ketter, who has worked extremely hard on organizing this. Well, our topic for the panel is politics and the changing nature of journalism. I think the genesis for this specific idea, by the way, started about a year ago in a conversation between my friend here, whom I'll introduce in a moment, Nick Coleman, when we were talking about the demise of newspapers in general, and if you'll forgive me, the absolute disaster that seemed coming to the Star Tribune back in the Twin Cities. And out of this, when I learned Al would be here, I thought what could be better than to put together a conversation on that theme with these people. And let me go through, for those of you who don't know everyone, a few words of introduction. Al Eisele is our first McCarthy Fellow in Residence. By this time, I would guess, looking across the audience, more people know his name and his face than they know mine, by the way. And I couldn't help but think today, as I was talking and listening to Al talk about a few things, if I may repeat a point that I have said about Gene McCarthy to many people, and have heard me say this many times again, but I love to say it. To me, Gene McCarthy was the quintessence of everything that was the best in our community in his generation. From politics to poetry, from Benedictines to baseball, the commitment to public life with a conscience, the wit, the intelligence, how literate the man was. And by the way, he wasn't a bad ball player either. And when I was thinking of that and listening to Al today, I realized Al is the perfect person in that mold. Al is a St. John's graduate, class of 58. He went on to military service. He served with the Pioneer. He became a reporter with the Pioneer Press. He became the PR man for Vice President Mondale. He went on to work with Control Data. Most of us know him in his most recent guise as the editor of The Hill, an inside the Beltway popular influential newspaper in regard to what really goes on in Congress and The Hill. Recently, Al has been a visiting scholar at the Wilson Center, the Kennedy Center, and the University of Oklahoma. He's the author of biographies of McCarthy and Humphrey, and I learned today that he hopefully will soon be the published author of a blockbuster biography of the life of Cardinal Cushing. More important, I think, in the memory of Gene McCarthy, and I don't mean to slight the senator, he made it to the majors. That is, Al pitched for the Cleveland Indians. Maybe Mary Beth can correct me on this. I think Gene only made it to semi-pro or something. I can't quite remember accurately. He is also, we also have the pleasure of his daughter, Kitty Eisele, who has joined us. Kitty and I crossed paths, a little too long ago to cite. We won't. She did a report on a Russian writer, a poet and friend of mine who had come to St. Paul to do a residency. Kitty is an Emmy Award-winning producer of Ken Burns' The Civil War series. She's an author, she's an editor, and a producer for National Public Radio. She is the senior editor of Morning Edition. She teaches journalism at Georgetown. And I believe, if I read her resume correctly, she has a novel.
In progress.
Pardon?
In progress.
Well, I'm reading from her resume. Her novel, Hope Diamond's Washington, is almost complete. Right? So we look forward to that. And finally, we come to our third panelist, Nick Coleman. Nick also loves baseball. I thought of that as a connection. And I couldn't help but think today, for a variety of reasons, Nick always makes me think about St. Paul. Nick and I are friends. In the interest of full disclosure, we're friends. When I think about St. Paul, I remember, I'm a Minneapolis guy, for those of you who don't know.
It's obvious, isn't it?
That's what I'm getting at. And I've always envied certain things about St. Paul. 20 years ago when I started working in St. Paul, it was always, that Nick Carraway thing about houses are called by decades by a family name, and everybody at downtown St. Paul seemed to know everybody, and I was always a bit jealous. And I'm Irish American, by the way. I did my career before I came here. I have any idea how many people used to say, "Wouldn't you be more comfortable living in St. Paul?" So I've always had this. But I'm trying to make a point about Nick and St. Paul. And, of course, I tried to do my research thoroughly today by picking up Nick is a columnist today for the Star Tribune. But to get to my point, this is the Twin Cities section of the Star Tribune today. Now, you can't pick it up. That is Nick up here, his column, right? Now, you can't see the gentleman clearly there, right? That's his brother, the mayor of St. Paul. I should also add that Nick...
More importantly, he's my godson.
Okay. An odd confusion that I never shared with Nick. I left Minnesota in the 60s and came back in the 80s. When I came back, I was somehow under the impression that a powerful, popular state senator had left politics and was writing for the papers. That's a joke for old-timers. His father is, of course, the late state senator, Nick Coleman. To be more precise on Nick's work, Nick went to the University of Minnesota. He was an editor of the Minnesota Daily. To be blunt, today he's my last hope for why I should read the Star Tribune. He has written on the media, city politics, state politics. He has a special interest. He's done beautiful work on Native American issues. He's written on Northern Ireland. He's been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize 5 times. And there is, in Nick's writing, first of all, always a voice for those who don't have a voice. Today is a beautiful article on the plight of the homeless, a man who lived in his car, in legislation that will deny that man's existence. A few days earlier, he was correcting the history of St. Patrick. He wrote a beautiful article about, 2 Sundays ago, I believe, that focused on the Church of St. Stephen's in Minneapolis, a refuge for the inner city's poor, and what was happening to it in regard to pressures from the diocese. It's a cliche, I guess, about writing truth to power and things like this. And let me put it this way. I would ask Lieutenant Governor Molnow if she thinks Nick writes truth to power. I doubt if she's one of his biggest fans out there. That's a political aside. I should say, I guess, a word about me and then shut up. I suppose I'm here because in my career, among journalists, I'm an academic. Among academics, they pass me off as a journalist. And I do a fair amount of commentary and punditry in the media, public radio, public television, and write for occasional op-ed pieces and this and that. But don't take that too seriously. Let me give you some caveats. I've had 3 regular gigs in my career in the media, actually 4. Okay, I used to do regular commentaries for Almanac, called Twin Cities Public Television on Friday nights, called Channel 3 Moscow. For a long time, I had a regular assignment. I was a commentator for a Minnesota public radio show called Worldview. Then I got a gig with Nick's newspaper. I used to be a regular contributor to a section called News with a View. For what it's worth, I was also hired and retained in the 80s and 90s by WCCO TV to be a commentator and analysis of things. Let me clarify why I went through that, not to brag. I was the kiss of death on virtually all of those projects. Worldview collapsed, News with a View and the Star Tribune collapsed. Almanac goes on fine, and I, in fact, continued. What happened to me there was, actually, my subject left me. I was a specialist in Soviet affairs, and I hung on for about 2 years, and then I realized the country doesn't exist anymore, and that's what happened there. But Don Shelby, whom I used to work with, and I are still in touch. And this is maybe a point that touches, I hope, not personally on me. I don't mean it this way. But when we get together, he always laughs. It's inconceivable, he says to me, that they would do such a thing on local nightly news as have some professor come on and talk. You know, it's almost ludicrous. Even at Channel 2, if I may say so, the producer, Bill Hanley, and I, he's the producer of Almanac, are very good friends. He says nice things about my career there. But he says it's ludicrous to think we would never do such international things like that again. And once again, I'll end my personal remarks and then get out of here with, I will say to you 2 things about my life and career in the media. Bill Hanley at Channel 2 always tells me before I step on the air, remember, Nick, most of the time you're too boring even for public TV. If you've ever watched Almanac, they have a call-in segment. My favorite one was recorded one Friday after I'd been on. It went like this. You had Nick Hayes on again. He is boring. He is the most boring person you have on Almanac, and that is difficult because I think everybody on Almanac is boring. You always have fundraisers. What you should do is create a recording of Nick Hayes talking and sell it to insomniacs. And I probably just proved his point by talking to him.
I'm sorry.
Huh?
I'm sorry. I shouldn't have called that.
All right. Enough said. Okay. What we're looking forward to is a spirited conversation. Everybody blames the media, it seems, for being too bland, for being too liberal, for being subservient before the power of the state, and so on and so forth. We speak of the end of the news as we've known it, as real news reporting seems to go more and more from politics to fluff. I am particularly concerned as I have watched the decline, particularly of television news, and particularly the decline of newspapers, as I have known them from my young adult life to today, in terms of being really a beacon and place where you saw excellent political coverage of my community. What I want to do is take the floor, let us just go from, say, Nick to Kitty to Al, and invite them to make just an initial response to the theme of tonight's panels, perhaps engage each other with a few remarks, and let us turn to the audience and try to engage all of us. This isn't meant to be a political harangue. It's meant to be a give and take of whatever issues come up in mind in regard to politics and the media, and to leave us all with a sense that there still is some hope in finding a political role for the media in this country. So with that, I'll turn the floor over first to my friend Nick.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I am the eldest brother, and godfather of the mayor of St. Paul. And that's because my parents had more children than they had friends. And when I was 11 years old, they just shoved me up by the baptismal font and pointed at the priest and said, "Say what he tells you to say." And my brother doesn't actually ask my advice on anything. It is a very complex and perplexing, difficult time for those of us who remain in the news business. And that's a smaller number every day. I was looking up the numbers. 80,000 jobs have been lost in the news industry since the year 2000. Half of those in newspapers. So it's not just newspapers. The others are in cable and in network news and so on and so forth. And if you think about the explosion of sources of news, how is it possible that there are that many more sources and that many fewer in the business? Well, in the Twin Cities, we have lost over the last year probably 25 to 30% of those working in the newsroom, and an aggregate experience total of, well, I think those numbers are probably about 150 people at the Pioneer Press and Star Tribune, probably somewhere in the, it's not an exaggeration, 3,000 years of journalism experience and knowledge of the Twin Cities and its people, its culture, its politics, and so forth. And this is, you cannot decapitate organizations like this. And in some ways it would be more painful if they were laying off the younger employees, people who have fewer options, instead of buying out the experienced people and ridding themselves of the ones who are there's a natural process. We move from the cradle to the grave, but they just took all the smart people, left me out, I guess, and they're gone from the ones who are the most experienced. And that has had a big price to pay that you can see in little ways. We have smaller resources, and we make embarrassing mistakes that editors would have gone crazy for. My old paper, the Pioneer Press, last summer, after you probably have heard of Nick Mancini, the famous char house guy on West 7th Street, my old neighborhood, passed away. If you've ever been in Mancini's, there's a whole wall devoted to athletes from my old high school, Cretin, because all of Mancini's kids went to Cretin and grandkids went to Cretin. And outside the funeral procession, which marched down the street from Assumption, they had the honor guard from Cretin High School, of course. But the front page, two front page photos in the Pioneer Press identified the honor guard as being from St. Thomas Academy, which is a mortal sin in St. Paul. Not very important, no, but it's the kind of thing that tells people, who are these people who run this paper? They don't know anything about this town. And we've had many similar experiences at the Star Tribune, and with the limited resources, our Capitol Bureau. Would you say this is a fairly important political era? Are there important debates over budgets and transportation and lieutenant governors and everything else? We got a governor running for vice president. We have half the people covering the Capitol that we used to. And the limited resources we did have, we sent a reporter and a photographer to Mother Russia to follow a teenage hockey player from here around Russia, and we did a 5-day front page. I love hockey even more than baseball, but we had a 5-day front page series about a kid hockey player who doesn't even go to a high school here locally. He's in a development program in Michigan, and you read that story 10 different times. My point is, the papers are kind of spinning out of control. They don't really know what they're doing anymore, and they're kind of just acting in a very panicky and very unfocused way. I would say that those of us who remain in it are worried that we've lost our reason for being, our journalistic compass, our purpose, whatever it was, and however you may have disagreed with it. It's better than just running around like a chicken with its head cut off, which is what it looks like sometime. And that is all, and against the backdrop of budget cuts, and you think the papers are failing, and certainly the trend lines are bad. But they're not actually losing money. They're still making gigantic piles of money, more money than the old publishers of the Star Tribune and Pioneer Press ever dreamed of making. But it's not enough. And so therefore, under the cover of it's a bad time, you know who loves to tell you how bad a time it is in the newspaper industry is the people who run the newspaper industry. Because under that guise, they can make moves, reduce more jobs, and squander the resources that we have. It's not a good time. And it has ramifications, and I think that Al and Kitty, whose great company it is to be in, can probably elaborate on how that looks from Washington. But I can tell you from St. Paul and Minneapolis, there is no doubt that the newspapers are kind of wandering right now and not sure what they're doing or how to do it, and just trying to make budget projections that may not even be connected that much to reality. And the price to pay is that people don't have less and less confidence in what they're reading in the newspapers, and then you get into this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy and loop where the papers look dumber and dumber, so people get more and more irritated and go away from it, and then they tell me, I canceled the paper and life looks better. And I said, well, that may be because you don't know as much about it, but maybe they're taking a happy pill. It's very, very disturbing. And I was able, after 35 years in journalism, because I went back and forth between the St. Paul and Minneapolis papers, I'm only eligible for 7, possibly 8 weeks of buyout pay. I have 6 children. So that's about 1.2 weeks of pay per kid. I can't go, and so I'm kind of stuck, and so I'm going to have to battle it out. But it's a fight worth having. Let's go to Kitty and Al, because I think they're seeing the same thing, at least maybe on a much larger scale.
I'm going to throw it to you.
Kitty, go ahead.
All right. Well,
You want me to go?
I think you should go, and then I'll figure out what to say after.
All right. I will go next.
print.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to begin. I want to exercise my prerogative as the first Eugene McCarthy Scholar in Residence at St. John's and St. Ben's. I've been reminded many times since I've been here. St. Ben's was not, and St. John's did not have the kind of close relationship they have now. When I was here 100 years ago, well, only 50 years ago. I graduated in 1958, and I'm pleased to see that 4 of my classmates, Lee Hanley, Roger Scherer, Jim Bassett, and Jack Taylor, are here too. I talked earlier at many of my classes, and I said that John asked me about John McCain, and I said he has one problem. He's very, very old. He's as old as I am. Okay. I want to thank particularly Nick Hayes, Jack Taylor, and Matt Lindstrom, who've done a wonderful job of organizing this whole week. Nick had mentioned something that always turns up in my biography, and people always comment on when they learn that I once played professional baseball. And I'm asked why I didn't make it to the major leagues, and I say it's because I threw too many low balls and drank too many high balls. I want to recognize a few people, special people. Ed O'Brien used to work for Alec Olson, who's here. Dave Hutchison and Betty Spaeth, who was the widow of my good friend Bob Spaeth. Dave Hutchison was the smartest kid to come to St. John's since Gene McCarthy. He had a straight A record at St. John's. I did not. I'm particularly happy to see them here. Also, my good friend Sister Coleman, former president of St. Ben's, his sister Emmanuel, former president. Sister Coleman, my wife and I went on a trip to Ireland last year with Sister Coleman, and we closed down every bar in Dublin that night, okay? Also, some of my former teachers here, and my good friend Abbot Timothy was not a teacher of mine, but Father Alberic and Father Don, who was then known as Father Camillus. Now, Father Camillus succeeded a great chaplain named Virgil O'Neill. And when I was a freshman or sophomore here, I once went to Father Virgil and I said, Father Virgil, I'm afraid I might be losing my faith because I'm not getting anything out of Mass. And he said, Eisele, you're too dumb to lose your faith. He said, you're not supposed to get something out of Mass, you're supposed to take something to it. So I learned that. And then also, not last but not least, my good friend John Gallardi, the winningest coach in the history of college football. Now, I was at the visiting professor at the University of Oklahoma last fall, and I got to know Barry Switzer, and the current, who was a past coach, won 3 national championships, and Bob Stoops, the present coach at the University of Oklahoma, who's won 1 national championship. And each of them, first thing I told them was, I come from Minnesota, which sent Oklahoma its greatest football coach, Bud Wilkinson. And then I said, I went to St. John's University, where John Gallardi is the coach. Each of them said, we know, everybody knows John Gallardi. We read all about him. Now, I hope there's a reporter in the crowd tonight, because I'm going to make some news. I talked to John yesterday, and I said, John, you've been here a long time. People are always asking, when are you going to retire? And he said, let me tell you, he said, I'm 80 now. I don't know if I have enough energy and enthusiasm to go on and coach for much more than maybe 1 or 2 more decades. Also, I want to recognize Beth Yarrow McCarthy, Senator Gene McCarthy's niece, who is here, and I'm delighted. I'm sorry? Mary Beth Yarrow McCarthy from Wilmer, and I'm delighted to see you here, Mary Beth. And finally, I want to recognize somebody I just met, Stan Mack, who is a superintendent of the Robbinsdale School District, and it turns out, he just informed me, that he was at the Chicago Convention of 1968 and got clubbed by the police and tear gassed, and so he really is a survivor of the infamous 1968 Chicago Convention. I want to comment quickly. I've told all of my classes here that when they ask me to predict the outcome of this 2008 election, I say never try to predict. Teddy White, the great presidential historian and biographer who wrote The Making of the President series, once told me, he said, political reporters should never try to predict. Always report what you see and what is happening and not what you think is happening, because unpredictable, unexpected events will happen to turn the course of the election. And of course, what did we just see 2 days ago? The governor of New York is stepping down, is no longer going to be the governor of New York come Monday because he's involved in a sex scandal. Now, that reminds me of the story of the great Minnesota governor Floyd B. Olson in the 1930s, who was known for consorting with gangsters and women of easy virtue. And a woman came up to him once and said, Governor, I understand you lead an immoral life. And he said, lady, that's a cross I got to bear. Pray for me. Now, to the subject at hand, journalism. I have spent all of my life, most of my life in journalism on both sides of the fence, both as a journalist and as working for Vice President Mondale. Incidentally, I'm known as one of the people who helped make Vice President Mondale what he is today, a lawyer in Minneapolis. Okay. Anyway, I have seen it from both sides. I've been privileged to be in Washington at a time when Minnesotans were really front and center and all part of the national story. 2 vice presidents, presidential candidates, secretaries of agriculture and commerce, and head of the CIA, and you name it. So it's been a wonderful time to be there. Incidentally, Nick Coleman's stepmother is the ombudsman of the Washington Post. I read her every Sunday, and she's doing a terrific job, as I know Nick is here. At the University of Oklahoma, I taught a course called From Gutenberg to Google, the Brave New World of Journalism in the Internet Age. And that says it all, because the Internet has changed everything, turned journalism upside down and made it, allowed anybody to be a journalist. I blog on the Huffington Post blog, which has a big readership, but I resent bloggers because it gives a housewife in Ottumwa, Iowa, or a dentist in Pocatello, Idaho, the right to do the same thing I do, which is to be a pundit. There are millions of blogs, but there are only a handful that are really influential and worth reading. But my point is, there is no reason for any citizen to not be well informed about what is going on, because there are so many sources of information, and you can access them on the web or wherever. In terms of the 2008 election, I think that cable television has become much more important in covering the election. I don't bother to watch the network news, but CNN, Fox, and cable, C-SPAN, I think, are doing a terrific job. The press has a lot of sins to answer for. We do not do the best job we should, but I have been to 80-some countries in my career, some of whom, like East Germany and the Soviet Union, no longer exist. but I've never been in a country that doesn't have a relatively free press that I would particularly want to live in. I think our press does, by and large, does a good job. It does not always do it as soon as it should. It does not do its job as well as it should, but I am, as you can see, a defender of the press. Churchill said democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. We have a system, fortunately, that the Founding Fathers put together with 3 co-equal branches of government that would keep each other in line if one got out of line, and inside of that they put a free, independent press that can nip at the heels of those in power, and occasionally, like Watergate and other times, take a big bite out of their rear ends. And that's what the press, the watchdog function of the press is. So I am not that pessimistic about the journalistic landscape, although I have to candidly admit that it is going through terrible turmoil. Every major newspaper I know is cutting back. My old company, Knight Ridder, no longer exists. So we are going. Journalism is going through a transition period, but and it'll come out something different. But I think it'll still come out something that serves the needs of the American people. With that, I'll turn it over to the woman who is the best writer in the Eisele family, my daughter Kitty.
Thank you. I'm happy to take that credit. It struck me that his tie is a Sanskrit or hieroglyphic, and I thought that's sort of ideal for a conversation about words and about how we talk to each other or inform each other or read. I have to say I teach a journalism class about every other semester, every other year at Georgetown, and it's once a week, 2.5 hours after dinner. So I am amazed that this many people turned out and are still awake, because I have a huge challenge with a 2.5-hour class. I have to move around a lot, and students are used to not listening, and they're certainly not used to sitting still and listening to a professor or the radio. So I've actually learned that a lot about conveying information is not just talking, even though that's my medium. It's just straight talk. It's putting pictures in your head, and then for me it's usually kind of forcing after-dinner students to get up and move around so they don't fall asleep. Maybe NPR, I'm assuming most of you are familiar with NPR and NPR here in this region. How many of you have kids who listen to public radio? Do you think they do, or do you know they do? Because a lot of people who, pardon? My greatest success. That is a success. Our biggest challenge, I think, is the next generation up, and I'm not terribly worried about it, mostly because I feel like my life is busy enough just getting the news out every day. But our management has been very nervous, in a way that I'm not sure they need to be, about who uses news and who consumes it, uses news on the radio. They've been part of something that's called the Bedroom Project that interviewed representative sample of young people from 15 to 25 about what's in their bedroom in terms of media, and only one had a radio. They all had iPods or computers. They had, even today in the classroom, I asked how people wake up, and it's all their cell phones. They set the alarm on their cell phones. So that has management nervous, but my flip side of that is that a lot of young people who everybody in the media wants to reach come back around to news a little later, especially if their parents listen to public radio. It's the last thing they want to hear in college. It's just enough. I grew up with it in the front seat. I really don't need to listen to more, Prairie Home Companion or whatever. They kind of come back around in their late 20s. So I'm not too worried about that. As far as NPR has been very fortunate, I think, fortunate in good and bad ways. In good ways that we had this major donation from Joan Kroc, who apparently met her husband Ray Kroc while she was a piano player at the Lexington Bar and Grill in St. Paul, and married very well. Criteria? That was a different bar?
Criteria.
Well, she picked well, and we were the beneficiaries because we got a $250 million endowment when she died in 2003, partly because she was a night owl, apparently, and stayed up and would listen to our very early morning broadcasts. Morning Edition comes on at 2 a.m. in Los Angeles. Broadcast live at 5 from Washington, but they start carrying it at 2. That's given us a lot of padding. It's not necessarily fueling a lot of high salaries, but it's paid for our Iraq Bureau, which is monstrously expensive and was something we expected to do for 6 months to a year. We're beginning our 6th year this month. So we didn't expect to be building and holding a bureau and paying $1,000 a day for security over 6 years. Because we had that buffer, it meant we didn't need to raise that extra money. That's a good reason that public radio, or at least National Public Radio as a news organization, has been maybe a little more comfortable than the newspapers. A bad reason is that I came there in 1998, and as our CEO likes to say, every year since then we've had the story of the decade. So beginning in 98 with Clinton's scandal and then the impeachment vote in 99, 2000 election that took 6 weeks to choose a president, 2001 obviously September 11th, the invasion of Afghanistan, anthrax was a big deal in Washington, the East Coast certainly, then the run-up to the Iraq War, and the beginning of the Iraq War, the 2004 election, and then Hurricane Katrina. So every year there's been fairly, in my lifetime, more dramatic news each year than maybe anybody expected. And that's driven our listenership up, I think, because there's such an appetite for understanding what's going on. We've doubled our listenership. I don't know about our membership, but we're up to 30 million listeners a week. And that's a pretty high number for anybody looking to advertise or put credits on. Morning Edition itself has 13 million listeners a week, and that's almost the equivalent of all 3 TV network morning shows combined, ABC, CBS, and NBC. So I hear an awful lot about fear of numbers and losing listeners, and I just think, well, it hasn't happened yet. We're flatlining a little, but, I mean, doubling your growth in 7 years is not something I'm scared of. Now, I do wonder about younger people who don't listen to the radio in the car because they've got iPods and chargers and all that. I'm confident they'll find their way to us, and maybe I need to be less confident, but it's certainly been my experience that people do get there. Even my students who always think, oh my God, I've got a radio professor for my journalism class, what's that about? End up finding narrative journalism they like. I would say one thing that NPR prides itself on, and whether or not that's fair, I know we talk about it, which is that our listener, we don't think of a listener as a consumer, first and foremost. We think of them, listener as citizen, and that's a different paradigm than most commercial broadcasting. And I don't think it makes us superior per se. It just means we have a more flexible approach to how we program, and that's brought along the underwriting with it, because the underwriters want to reach our audience. We're fortunate in that. I think that the fear that NPR has, that a lot of the member stations have, is the same thing, is the explosion of outlets for news and ideas, and everybody's an authority, and I think that's not bad. I think that I don't read many blogs because I don't have time. I don't find them necessarily adding to my day. But if people are out there talking and hopefully informing each other, encouraging each other to learn, people will find their way to something approaching information. And I do think they end up coming back. You know, they call it the flight to quality in business terms. When the economy gets rocky, people want really stable and steady investments. That is the tone that I think we took after we noticed the increase in listenership, particularly after 9/11. It doesn't mean we don't have the same challenge of what CNN calls the iJournalist. I think they mean the internet journalist when they have somebody post their video or post their photos, but it looks like the me journalist, like everybody gets to be a journalist, which I'm fine with. You need a curator, you need somebody to sort of sort through that, and that's what NPR, I think, does. And it certainly feels like that's what my job there is, which is somebody defined very well journalism. I'm not out to topple power necessarily, and a friend defined it as sharing lives. So if we're sharing lives and hopefully having a conversation across America, that what you hear is other Americans in places you never really would have gone to or known about, then we are better informed. You know, that's a bar that we rarely hit. It's certainly one that every morning feels like we're not going to make it. We're barely getting on air every day. And that's after 30 years of a show. We still feel like we're, you know, trapeze artists. And maybe the show will all come together in time. And it does every day, but I don't know how. And I guess I can't fault our political coverage in that the volume of it has been enormous, and we're all getting tired of covering debates. We've had 19 Democratic debates, maybe 20 by now. We're kind of like another debate. Is there anything left to say? And how many primaries, I don't know, but I'm not worried about our level of political coverage. I'm worried about a wider range of voices coming in. We do have a tendency to go to the same talking heads and get the same sort of received wisdom and very insider ball. If anything, I want to hear more from people outside the Beltway, because they're all echoing each other anyway on cable TV. I will tell you a couple of things that make me really value particularly print reporting. I just judged a contest for best energy writing in the country, and I can't tell you who won, but I can tell you who I favored, which was all a print contest. And by far and away, the best series of articles came from somebody at the Charleston, West Virginia Gazette about mining inspections. And I had no idea that that paper had such depth of reporting, but it was one beat reporter who spent a lot of time going through records after some mine deaths and documented the cut under the Bush administration of funds for investigation and for mine inspection, which is supposed to happen quarterly, and it then, because of a 20% cut in inspectors, had moved to spot inspections with no one being informed that that's how it was being done. And he was able to correlate the inspection rate and the mine accident and mine death rate. And I thought, you know, where else do you have beat reporters doing this? It's really important. And there were other good stories in that group of things we judged, but they tended to be specials about global warming. And with the exception of the Wisconsin paper, everything else was stuff I'd already known. It was well packaged and well reported, but it was kind of like the I-Team doing the big, long series about global warming that you can pretty much get anywhere, but it had nice graphics. But having a kind of boring beat that involves going to the Bureau of Mines and looking at, you know, safety records, that matters. And I don't know what's going to happen to that kind of beat reporting that people don't want to grow up and go into because it doesn't make much money and it's not glamorous and it's the first thing on the chopping block. I looked at that and thought that deserves the prize. That is important journalism. And we can't do that ourselves. We don't have enough people. But I hope that those kind of publications carry on, especially in regions that don't have other kind of oversight, don't have an outside authority challenging sort of the dominant industry there. And I think that I should shut up and ask for some questions and see what people, because I don't get out of NPR that much, I kind of want to know what people want to hear more of or where they think that we aren't paying attention well enough.
My name is Dave Simpkins. I publish the Stock Center Herald. That's where Sinclair Lewis got his start. And I've been in the newspaper business for I love it. And it is a problem. But I've been to 38 Minnesota newspaper conventions, and they're getting worse and worse and worse. I went to a seminar 2 years ago at the convention about benchmarks and how we can be more profitable and watch, measure everything, how much sports you have, how many inches of news, and it just showed the very essence out of what a lively newspaper is. And I walked out of there really mad, just ready to give up. But I sort of did. I sold 30% of my newspaper to my staff because I didn't want a Fargo Forum or a corporation to buy my newspaper. And at the time, I'm an optimist. I love people. And I figure there's always a solution. There's got to be a solution somewhere. But I think what's happening to the Star Tribune, the LA paper, it's terrible. It's getting to be, it's greed. Newspapers are profitable. But look, they're just a stockholder. We got to turn this thing around. We got to have advances. We got to have increases. They're going to choke. And it makes the newspaper work.
Simpkins. That's a communist name, isn't it? You sold 30% of your paper to the workers? Sit down. It's like, you are so out of touch. No, go ahead.
The solution I think I see is maybe that NPR model, the public model, that at some point perhaps we can get together a nonprofit organization that when the equity investors in the Star and Tribune decide they want to take their profits, that maybe a nonprofit can buy it and be satisfied with the normal profit and don't have to choke everything out and really provide people with a good piece of newspaper. I think we're going to end up with CBS and NBC type news in our weekly newspaper.
I'd just like to respond briefly. I mean, the Eiseles, they have an optimism gene in their family. They're very optimistic.
I mean, we don't have an exit strategy.
And B, yes, public radio is, of course, the Cadillac of the news business, and it's a national audience, national funding, but you've been under immense pressure politically to change and alter some of the ways you approach the news over the years. Those same kind of political and cultural pressures have been brought on all parts of the media, and particularly on newspapers. And that beat reporter in West Virginia, I don't know who owns that paper, maybe it's a locally owned one, which are the last hope for newspapers, but they, perhaps that guy will be the first one to take the buyout in the next time, and there won't be anybody who knows where the Bureau of Mines is on that paper anymore, let alone know how to search through the records. We have a paper, at the Star Tribune, still the largest, most influential media outlet of any kind in Minnesota, I would think. Certainly, even I think possibly more important than public radio. Don't throw anything. And but its focus has changed completely over the last couple of years. They don't really care about, the editorial page has been instructed not to write about national and international issues. The war in Iraq has been going on 5 years. People say it's no longer an issue. One reason it's not an issue is the editorial page of some papers like the Star Tribune can't even write about it anymore. They've been told not to write about certain aspects of the transportation infrastructure disaster in the state and ways to solve it. There are political restructurings and re-engineerings of the newspaper to make it more palatable to some kind of imagined, more conservative consumer audience in the exurbs of the Twin Cities area. They've actually got key zip code maps that were devised by the last publisher who was last seen at 425 Portland Avenue skedaddling across the street after a court order throwing him out of the building, finding him guilty of breaking 2 laws, state laws, and stealing proprietary information from his previous employer. He's still in town. He'll probably be back in September when the judge's writ against him runs out. They have taken national, international stories out of the newspaper. Local is the focus. We end up with brainless stories about kitty cats and things like that on the front page. They're throwing the audience to making us rely on national public radio, and thank God you're there, and on the internet for actual information about what's going on in our world. The other day, I've written over 3,000 columns, 25 years. The other day, a column of mine that was a timely news event column related to an event that was going to happen the day it was published was kept out of the paper for lack of space. That's never happened. Ever. They put it in the paper the next day, but it was too late as far as the news value of it. I thought we were working for a newspaper here. And, you know, it is changing in so many ways that are imagined as selling, as marketing, a paper that, as I say, is still hugely profitable, and maybe the trends aren't in the right way, but we don't have underwriting, and we need advertising, and we need subscribers, and they don't care in that key zip code map. The Twin Cities of Minneapolis-St. Paul, 14th largest media market in the country, still important to 2.5 million people who live there. The middle of those Twin Cities don't really matter very much to the marketing of the paper and the tailoring of the news and the opinions, for that matter. And the paper is, you know, it was a day after Christmas a year ago. We were summoned to a meeting and found we had a meeting where someone said up at the front of the crowded room, "You've been sold to a company named Avista." And I said, "You mean the people who make those glass domes on the Amtrak cars? Who are these?" No, it's not that. It's not Vista Dome. It's Avista. They made jack-up platforms in the Gulf of Mexico. I don't know what a jack-up platform is, but they got one in Minneapolis now. And I don't even know who they are. And they've never had a newspaper before, and they may never have one again. But the one they have is wobbling, and I think it's people on the staff. We've lost a lot of friends, a lot of expertise, and maybe some changes and redirection were necessary. It's a competitive environment. I'm not suggesting we ought to do a Simpkins model here and, you know, socialize the newspaper, but I think we're. Pardon? Well, the public, yes. Why? You know, there are billionaires in the Twin Cities who always talk a good game about they'd like to, you know, have that kind of thing, a newspaper, and because they think it's of use and value, but they're not willing to put their money where their mouth is, and I don't know where the nonprofit might come from. But if public radio and television and bloggers for that matter, you know, we gave the milk away so nobody buys the cow anymore. You can go on the internet and read anything in the newspaper. So they rely on that for information. The actual information source is developed and prepared, not by bloggers. So I've never seen a blogger at a press conference yet. I don't see bloggers at City Hall or at the Bureau of Mines. They're in their basement shooting, you know, acting like the old critics who, you know, came down from the mountains after the battle was over and shot the wounded. They don't know what's really going on. They're just, you know, basically robbing corpses. And, you know, they're not really telling us anything. And they're not going to give us the information that you and actually all of us for our discussion and for the health of our nation rely on. And, you know, you can find out a lot about what's going on in the kitty cat corner of the Twin Cities, and there's more to it than that, but almost everything that goes into the paper now is thought about how it will appear, how it will be perceived. Will it help or hurt our image? Not what is the truth and what do people need to know and when do they need to know it? It's pretty basic and it's going away. And instead of canceling subscriptions, I wish people were more involved in trying to turn it around and change it.
Nick, let me ask you, the obituary you cited, did that go on the Trib's website?
Which, I'm
Since
sorry.
space is not a problem on the website.
The obituary.
Huh?
No, the column I wrote, no, it did not go on the website. The website, for whatever else they say, is still kind of, you know, the red-haired stepchild of the newspaper. So it's, you know, it's very inconsistent in what you can find there and what's promoted there on the web. It's not, you know, that nobody wants a newspaper anymore because you got to put it in a bundle and tie it up and put it out on the curb and you get the stuff on your hands. But you can't find stuff on the internet. It's hard to. You can't turn the page and see what's next. And, you know, no, it didn't. There's sometimes stuff on the internet that's not in the paper, but a lot of things are not going in the paper. I've written a number of columns about the transportation thing and the bridge collapse in Minneapolis and everything else. And I had an editor tell me, do you realize how many times we've had to hold a story about the bridge or Carol Molnau because you were writing about it? And I said, what? Why? Why would you hold a story because I was writing about it? It's good to have stories and columns that are about the same things, and then people can discuss it and try to analyze it and interpret it. And I was told, no, that makes it look like we're trying to spin something. And so they're holding stories about what's actually happening because they're uncomfortable because I'm writing a column about it. That's wrong. But that's the reality. And that's just one tiny little part of how the mix is being considered every day and how it's being played. And it's very, I know that, you know, at public radio, God thank you. I heard Steve Inskeep this morning on your network grilling Hillary Clinton in a sit-down interview. It was a very tough interview. I've never heard such a direct, tough follow-up interview. It was wonderful of a presidential candidate. I thought it was fantastic. But, you know, without that, or without the perspectives and the new ventures of people like Al, who with The Hill, I think, was really developing new forms of journalism, there wouldn't be much in our local newspapers to keep people in the business. It's very grim from the perspective of where local newspaper people sit.
One of the biggest concerns I have as a young person, as a college student, is kind of the political tone has become so acidic and so venomous everywhere you look. You know, you can't say anything, and you know, if someone says something, people would say, "Well, I don't have to listen to you because I disagree with you." And God forbid anybody, you know, comes to a consensus on anything because that might make you look weak. So, what do you see as the implications of this trend on young people? And what do you see as your role as journalists to kind of bring people back into the fold and start that conversation so, you know, we can find consensus and we can find common ground to, you know, just grow as a country?
I'll jump because I sit at Morning Edition at night, so I'm the editor from about 4 p.m. till about 1 a.m., which is usually when people go home who are, reporting the news and when the overseas folks are getting up and checking in. And in front of me, they've put 2 TV screens that are usually one of the cable channels, and I mute them because I don't want to hear it. It's too loud, and I don't need it. I already know what's going on. And we've come to call those the screaming white guys, because that's usually what they're doing. And you can pick up a lot from a lot of really smart people that are on those cable shows, but the point is to grab your attention, and that's going to have to be at a high volume or, a sort of a ponied up argument so that it looks like there's drama. And a couple of my colleagues actually appear on Fox, and I've talked to them like, how do you put up with that kind of demeaningness? And they're kind of like, well, it's not personal. It's part of the medium. And if anything, we get accused of being so tired and sleepy and neutral sounding, and I agree with that problem. I think we can sound a little too friendly and too kind of bland. That's just going to be the nature of the media. That's the nature of people trying to get your eyeballs. The other thing that is striking to me is that cable's audience is not that big. It's a very influential audience. It's always on in your airport or physically where you are that's in a public space. It's usually CNN or MSNBC, but the numbers are tiny. So I don't quite know why it has this multiplier effect of the shouters kind of coming everywhere, but I still don't understand who likes watching them, because I can't listen. It's like too much.
The opposite side of that coin, I think, though, is that some media outlets deliberately avoid, contention, and there, I think you're also being robbed of something. What Kitty and you may be talking about on cable, if you turn at the gym, I listen to ESPN. That's all they do is argue about, is this guy a bum or is this guy a hero? But it's the same exact thing on Fox or CNN. It's the same argument and the same formula. It's just they don't care. These sports writers, do they care about whether this guy's a bum or a hero? No, it's just a way to talk, and that's why it is a formula. But in local newspapers where people have shied away from this kind of thing, they're very, very afraid of upsetting anybody. And I think it is a challenge for young people. I was saying this in a class earlier today. You have so much information and so much distraction and so much isolated bits here and there that you're really not, it's difficult to get a connected overview and to not be turned off by all the arguing. And I think that is a role that the much maligned and, vanishing daily newspaper provided. Was like, hey, here's a whole plate full of a buffet of information. Go through it at your leisure. Read the letters. There's some angry people there. The cartoon is, even editorial cartoons are opinion cartoons are vanishing. Those jobs are going away. And publishers primarily, don't want to have any strong opinions, even in a cartoon format in the newspaper, and so they're becoming blander and blander. And if you watch The Daily Show, it's bleep bleep. Every other word is bleep bleep because it's all foul mouth. If you read The Onion, it's all dirty stories. If you turn on CNN, it's The Bedroom Project. No, wait, that was NPR. It was Spritzer, or whatever his name is. I thought that was The Bedroom Project. So, it's all this. The newspapers, by contrast, are trying not to offend anybody so much that they become more and more boring and they seem less and less valuable. And you're going to have to work really hard to get what you're wanting, which is, I don't think you want to avoid argument. You don't want to avoid contention or difference of opinion. You just want to get it in an informed, meaningful way. And you do at public radio. I've actually been talking about teaching some kind of opinion class because people don't know what opinion is anymore. They think, young people, especially your age, think everything in journalism is opinion. That's not true. But everybody has an opinion, and everybody's opinion is as valid as somebody else's. So we have 350 million opinions about any topic in this country, and no wonder we're all tired of turning on cable or whatever. But what is sorely missing, and what I think, places like on the internet, public radio, and other venues give you is a chance to try to get some intelligent argument, and doesn't even have to be a correct argument as long as it's supported and intelligent and provocative and makes you think it's doing its job. It's the shouting that people are tired of.
I want to follow up real quickly on that, because when I lived in the Twin Cities, I covered the arts for Minnesota Public Radio, and one thing we had, it was hard for the critics in the city. This is a very powerful area for artistic, or anything artistic innovation, but it was hard for the critics, I think, to be too critical, because the paper would push them a little on that, and it's a very nice place. And I noticed it every time you went to the theater. Everyone got a standing ovation. We joked, it's the Minnesota Standing O. It doesn't matter who it is. You have to stand up because you're glad they got here and stayed in the winter. So I found there was a lack of, and I see it some in my students, a sort of unwillingness to get too engaged. It's sort of the whatever, oh, I don't want to offend anybody. I don't really want to engage, and I don't want to put myself out there. I mean, I don't want to hear the screaming people, but I really agree that there needs to be a way to have argument and critical thinking. And probably because I grew up in the East, people are a lot more used to opinion there, and I had to, it really was, it's shocking when I moved here that people didn't volunteer opinions and that I was looked at as a very loud person for having them or talking with my hands. I think it can be regional, where opinion is encouraged, where difference of opinion is encouraged publicly, can often have to do with where you are physically. And certainly other places in this, U.S. aren't going to value it or maybe encourage it as much as cities like D.C. or New York do. Although I know with the Spitzer thing the other night, I thought the entire world was talking about Spitzer, and a friend called from New York who used to write in St. Paul and said, no one can talk. Everybody's jaws just open, and this is like the thing you'd think everyone had an opinion on, and we're all walking around like, I don't know what to say. And I thought, well, of all stories, I need some people to react to, and no one quite knew what to say yet. So I would say encourage arguing. It's not a bad thing. It's how you get ideas out. And, the best people I know in Washington can walk away from an argument and feel like they had a good time.
Challenge authority, man.
But it doesn't always go down in Minnesota. I've learned that.
Got a question there.
I was listening to Pledge Week on NPR a couple weeks ago, and somebody called in and challenged the people. What are you giving us this line? You don't do commercial radio. You folks do commercials
Yeah.
all the time. And then the NPR folks came back and sort of laid out their position in more detail than I'd ever heard before. And it's true, they don't do like product persuasion. They don't tell you to run out and buy something. And I think this really divides NPR from all the other media, because all the other media are trying to support themselves by telling you to run out and buy something. So do they want critical thinkers? Do they want people who ask for evidence before they believe what they're told? Those aren't the customers they want. They want the people who are easily persuaded, who will take your word for it, who will swallow anything you throw at them. And let's give the devil his due here. The people on the business side are getting smarter and smarter at telling the difference. So they try to get the readers that their advertisers want.
Mm-hmm. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that as long as you call that, we're putting out a shopper here, because that's not a newspaper and that's not journalism.
Okay, your newspaper is evolving into a shopper. That's what's going on.
I second the motion. I think that they should have, when companies buy newspapers, I think there should be a statutory requirement to change the name, because it's not the same as it was before. They may still call it the Star Tribune, the trucks are still green, but it's not the same.
Well, jump in and then why don't you go ahead?
Excuse me, I'm Jim Bassett. I'm as old as Al Eisele, so that's candidate Hutchison. For the two Nicks, there's a little newspaper that kind of started up on the internet called the In Post.
Yeah.
And it has a whole bunch of really good writers that came from the Tribune and the Pioneer Press, late off writers. They seem to have raised a ton of money, like over $1 million from the last thing I saw. Do you think this is a wave of the future, so to speak, or what do you think?
If I can respond first, apropos of my initial remarks on my media career, I'm totally enthusiastic about MinPost, but I'm only nervous because they've asked me to start writing for it.
It makes me nervous, too.
And I'm sure Nick can elaborate, but...
Well, I think it is
No, not about me. I'm talking about... I discovered MinPost, I think, actually by watching Almanac or hearing references to it. And I was totally delighted because I thought I saw a shift there of many of the colleagues Nick has described, who had either jumped ship or been pushed off the ship of the Pioneer Press, the Star Tribune. A number of others who never really had a regular gig.
And some of them shouldn't have. But I'm afraid that you're right, that it is the wave of the future in some ways that make me uncomfortable, and I can tell you one. Most of these writers that have credentials and reputations and professionalism, they left their newspaper jobs because they didn't need a newspaper job anymore. They're either at retirement age and collecting Social Security, they're wealthy, they're married to someone who is wealthy, and they're working for $100 a piece, which you can't get anybody to go into that who's actually feeding a family and trying to make a mortgage payment. So I kind of put it almost in the hobby journalist category, but I think, I mean, to give it its due, it's trying to invent a new way of covering. These people do go to press conferences. They do talk to news sources. They have a history and a perspective. They would never make a mistake like that was made in front of Mancini's by the Pioneer Press because they know this area and this community and have invested many years of their lives in it. But you can't make a living that way. And so those people are going to get older and finally really retire or die, and who's going to replace them except, well, at that point, I hope to make it that far, yeah. But it is trying. They have I think, a very interesting array of writers, and Nick would be a great addition, all kidding aside. But they seem to be lacking. It's a beautiful bun with sesame seeds and toasted and some butter on it and everything else, but there's no burger in the middle. There's no actual hard news substance of the day. It's a bun. And somehow they have to figure, and they can't afford what they would really need to cover the news of the day. So you get all these kind of feature-ish spins and analyses around the edge, but you don't have the middle. I think they're aware of that, and they're trying to figure out ways to do that, and MinnPost could be really a model. There are other ones around the country that could be a model for how to do that. But it's too early, and their money may be running out. So I hope they succeed because we need them to. But we need to be able to finally, this young man in that second row from the back there who was talking earlier, you're going to have to find a way to get him into journalism and help him support his family or his sports car or whatever from now until retirement.
I'm Randy Krebs. I'm the opinion page editor at the Times here in St. Cloud. And I don't know, I think you've depressed me enough now that I can leave. But seriously, I would really argue, and I'm the opinion page editor, so that's kind of the nature of the beast. I don't think a lot of the daily papers in Minnesota that are not the Star Tribune or the Pioneer Press are nearly as in dire straits as you all make it out to be. And I will tell you that in 20 years of being at the Times, I have never, ever seen someone tell us, don't run a story because it's going to make someone uncomfortable.
Well, I'm sure you're right about the local newspapers, and I don't think the Star Tribune is nearly in the dire straits that its ownership paints it as or would like us to believe, and here's the reason. They're not here for the long term. Who owns you? Gannett. How long has Gannett owned the Times? It's over 20 years, I'm sure, 30, going on 30 years, and they have a stake by now in providing a newspaper that's in touch and committed to that community. We are in the weird situation of having a company that isn't really a newspaper company and doesn't plan to be a newspaper company that has got their building and our parking lots are up for sale right now. If you want to buy them, Ziggy Wolf may be ahead of you in line. But, they're only here for the short term. And they're here, they are like, that's first Star Wars movie, did you see that? What was the name of the guys in the desert? Like if your sand crawler broke down, they jacked it up and took everything off it and junked it. That's sort of what we have as ownership of the paper. These are strip and flip private equity investors who come in They're trying to get as much value out of it, sell it as fast as possible, and perhaps a year from now, everything will be looking a lot better because we're owned by a Gannett or some legitimate news company that, despite its budget constraints, is least committed to the long term. But the Star Tribune is not alone in this. It's papers, and big papers. It's the major ones with the big profit centers and revenue streams that are the ones being targeted by these kind of companies.
The other thing I'd like to ask you is, it's about the internet, and Al was at the time to talk about it somewhat. The thing you call the website of the Scrib the red-haired stepchild. Our little red-haired stepchild has 2 million hits a month, page views. It's the fastest growing part of our operation. It's not nowhere near.
Is it profitable?
I'm a news guy. I don't know that. My question to you is, how do you monetize that? So you can attract the young readers, so you can do the kind of journalism you claim, because I don't necessarily agree with what you claim.
Andy, let me respond to that. I worked with Andy's father when he was at the Duluth Herald News Tribune, and I was a Washington correspondent for the St. Paul and Duluth and Knight Ridder newspapers. As I said, Knight Ridder, my old chain, no longer exists. It got bought out. But the point is that every newspaper, including mine, is putting enormous resources into websites, into delivering the news via the internet. Now, nobody or few papers have figured out how to make any money on the internet, unless you're a pornographer or something. It's very hard to do, but that gives them a much broader audience. We have readers from Moscow to Beijing to wherever because of our website. And I think every newspaper is migrating to that. So there are new forms of journalism that come along. In terms of profits, newspaper owners have been spoiled for years. Knight Ridder used to make 20, 22, 25% profit. They're now, before they were sold out, they were making down in 12 or 13, and they're still making a lot of money, but they're not making the kind of money they were.
There's no other industry in this country with those kind of profit margins, and those would be twice, at 12 or 13, that's twice what old Mr. Ritter, when you first started at the Pioneer Press, would have been happy with.
Well, the mindset of a publisher is like when I worked for the Mankato Free Press. I was told a story about a previous editor who complained to the publisher about his low salary. He said, well, I can't pay you more, but let me give you a tip. When you buy bacon, buy it by the pound and not sliced, and you'll save money.
Let me ask just one more thing to Mr. Krebs here, because when yes, okay, sorry. Randy? It's, when I say it's the red-haired stepchild, I mean if you're relying on it for a representation of what is actually in the newspaper, good luck, because the stuff that you're going to go on the internet at 7 in the morning and the lead story is going to be a lumber truck turned over on 494 and there's a backup all the way to Lindale. Well, you can see that on Channel 5 while you're shaving. So in fact, you can see the video of it. I don't know why they do that stuff, but they're constantly fooling and changing it to try to get people to come back and hit it again and again, but they're not giving you the newspaper. They're giving you something else, and they haven't really figured out how to make that newspaper jump out of there or how to make a profit out of it, but they're very extremely interested in trying to improve those things. It's a moving target, and things are changing, and Gannett's under many of the same pressures that everybody else. My old employer, Knight Ridder and Els, he says that was bought out. I say it's sold out. They did not protect that company, and Anthony P. Ridder, Mr. Parr Ridder's father, who's the head of that corporation, did not take the steps that were necessary to protect the stock by having classes of proprietary stock. Some kind of shark, what was his name? Bruce Sherman came in and decided he could make a giant profit carving up one of the most distinguished, the second largest chain at the time in the country, and with lots of Pulitzer Prizes and prize-winning international and foreign reporting, a great bureau in Washington and many overseas. And this is an ancient history. This is 2006. And they left that company exposed. The shark went after it. McClatchy, who owned the Star Tribune at the time, made a preposterous bid for the thing. The result is Knight Ridder is gone. The Pioneer Press, which was a strong, independent, proud newspaper, which both of us worked for, was then bought by McClatchy, which then dumped both papers. One to Media News, based out of Denver, and a guy run by Dean Singleton, who's kind of a loose cannon. Nobody knows exactly what his long-term plans are. And the other one to Avista. And so Tony Ritter Sr. not only, sold out and left the company exposed and made millions, by the way, on these deals. Everybody in the country named Ritter made at least $1 million off of the loss of this company. Hundreds of jobs in the Twin Cities were lost, thousands around the country as a result of this. And both newspapers in the state of Minnesota, one of, a state I used to really think was something special, are in vastly weakened positions because of that disaster, which is less than 2 years old, and we're still seeing what the consequences are.
And Peter, I'd like to ask a question regarding your positions in Washington. When you're receiving...
I'm sorry, can you speak up a little more?
When you're receiving information for the Hill or for NPR, do you ever think after 9/11 and after the U.S. Patriot Act and Valley Claim, if there's kind of a feeling in the back of self-censorship that you have and your staff have at both institutions, and how you come to grips with self-censorship and taking a story and informing the citizens?
Short answer is no. I don't worry about self-censorship. I tell our young reporters, we've hired, since we started the Hill 14 years ago, we have sent more than 70 young reporters onto major jobs in newspapers and broadcast organizations, because we hire young reporters with not much experience. We work them hard, try to teach them good reporting and writing skills, pay them very little, but they get to cover the best stories in town, in Washington, and they get noticed and picked up very quickly. We have a former reporter working as now a staff writer for the New Yorker, for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, you name it. We just had one that came back, and this sums up both problems. A young reporter who was the Moscow bureau chief for the Baltimore Sun, one of our former reporters, and the Baltimore Sun was bought by the Tribune, owned by the Tribune Company, which owns the LA Times, Chicago Tribune, Baltimore Sun, and so on, and was recently bought by a billionaire developer in Chicago. They've closed down all of the Baltimore Sun's foreign bureaus. She's back here now without a job. That point is that the economic pressures that newspapers are undergoing are enormous, but there are a lot of other opportunities, and she's found a job with a website that covers Eastern Europe. I think I tell our reporters, you don't want to be loved, you want to be respected, and you have a lot of power. You don't ever be intimidated by a public official, no matter how high he or she is. I've been called a liar by the President of the United States several times, and I'm proud of it. And that doesn't bother me. I think reporters have got to have a tough skin, and they've got to be aggressive and ambitious, and we teach our reporters to do that. I must say I'm a little bit puzzled by what I've heard about the papers in Minnesota. I don't cover them read them that closely, but from my reading of newspapers on the East Coast and around the country and the world on the web, I don't see any diminution of journalistic integrity and aggressiveness and so forth. I don't see any newspapers that are self-censoring themselves. The New York Times isn't, the Washington Post isn't, and they're under the same economic pressures. The best reporter of the Supreme Court, Linda Greenhouse of the New York Times, just took a buyout the other day. The new publisher of the Washington Post just announced they're going to have buyouts and layoffs. But okay, that's nature of the business. It's a business after all, and publishers are in the business to make money. Newspapers and news organizations will adjust. They'll find new ways to distribute the news and new ways to make money, I'm convinced.
I'll give you a couple of answers on that, because I don't know how soon we need to wrap up. But I was laid off at Minnesota Public Radio when they decided they didn't want as much arts coverage, and they knocked out 40 of us. So I've learned since then, there's no entitlement to be a reporter or a journalist. Whoever owns the machine gets to print the money, and that's Bill Kling. And if he doesn't feel like doing arts coverage, fine. We used to joke that none of us really needed to know about the value of the Deutschmark or the yen that day. Apparently there was a big crowd in Minnesota that did need to know that, but that's where the arts coverage was often getting shunted off to, as a business segment. So that was 1995. I don't think I've ever thought that I've had a right to have employment as a journalist since then, and I've certainly often thought of having a backup plan. Personally, I'm spending so much time on computers and digitally editing audio that I get a lot of physical issues with that. So I don't think I'm in this for the long run if it is going to be 9 hours at a computer terminal. And at the speed at which things happen, I do feel a little abraded at times. So, you know, it may be that it's a young person's game, but it's also whoever decides that they are going to invest in it gets to decide how it's done. And I'm lucky I'm at a place that so far the payers, the investors, the listeners, have agreed to subsidize. But that's a model that may change a lot. The flip side of it is, and I see another hand over there, that we don't yet know how this web delivery is going to work. It's scaring stations because they exist because you send them money and then they send us fees. But we could get by, in theory, without stations because we can go to you on the web. We don't do that because we're a creation of the stations. But the big question is how come I can't get my story when I want it? I can't get Morning Edition when I want it because, you know, Minnesota, this station here will only program it from 7 to 9 a.m. and listeners are getting used to, and viewers are getting used to watching what they want when they want. And that's happening in radio. The same way that PBS got a lot of competition with cable networks, it's starting to happen for radio. So I don't know what the answer is, but I know we're looking at possible. There's a trick with the economics of it that if you start podcasting stuff, and we're having a lot of success with the music, you can also sell sponsorships visually, or sponsorships on your podcast that says brought to you by such and such. And that actually may turn around the economics so that we can broadcast music stuff and make a little income off that different way of broadcasting or reaching you, and cut a deal for the station so that they're not charged as much. I mean, there may be weird economics that we can't see that are starting to come up. If you go on the NPR website, you'll see little TV ads, like very small, but they're there. And that's primo real estate, and the companies know it. To answer your question about intimidation, yes, I have felt that. And I felt it because I was in a nonprofit medium that's been targeted by the administration, multiple administrations, or multiple members of the House, for political bias. So it was very clear to us, and I never write anything politically opinionated on my email that has NPR on it, as similar tactic with most of the people I know who will not commit it to print, because things get forwarded so easily. And anybody that looks like they're saying politically having an opinion expressed with NPR, I can't have a bumper sticker on my car for any campaign candidate. So I would leave it at that. I'm conscious of it, put it that way.
I might ask that we take just one more question and wrap things up. Gentleman over there in the far corner.
Yes, my name is Nick. I'm a third year student.
You're going to have to speak up a bit.
My name is Nick. I'm a third year
Good choice.
A lot of Nicks here tonight.
Yes. I spell mine without a C. There you go. I've been practicing journalism since high school. It's definitely practicing. And last semester I decided to be a co-news editor for a campus paper. And after that semester I decided to resign. And my concern, my reluctance to be a journalist is not based on fear or uncertainty about job stability, job security. My concern is that it's going to take over my life. If I stopped thinking about this for a day, let alone a half a day, I'd end up apologizing to someone else on Wednesday night, on production night, for forgetting something. I didn't want to live that way. I wanted a break. I wanted to have a life outside of my job. Is it possible to be a full-time journalist?
Full-time journalists can have a life. Balanced life.
I think
You know, that's a good, there is a very perceptive and intelligent young man. I wish you'd been my friend 40 years ago. So. Is it possible? I mean, it is a consuming life because it draws people who are interested in current events. The pace of those current events has gotten faster and faster. When I started writing a column, there were weeks where I thought, what is there to write about? And now, every day, it's like, of all the things there are to write about, how am I going to pick one? And there's so much going on. The world, the pace of change, the pace of communication is instant. And yes, they're at Kitty here. I know exactly how she feels. I don't edit tapes on radio. I'm a newspaper guy. I do my main work walking around on a street corner with a notebook and a pen like I always did. But 8 hours a day, I'm at a computer terminal. I'm at a laptop. I'm answering email. I'm checking the internet. I'm reading blogs. I'm trying to figure out what is going on and who's getting ahead and who's getting clobbered. And it is, and you believe me, my wife doesn't like it. It's because, and she used to be a journalist, and she got out of it, and I think her life is much happier. But if you're, on the other hand, ignorance is bliss. So it's do you want to be blissfully whistling while the bombs drop because you weren't paying attention, or do you want to know what's happening and try to head it off? It's the choices we all make in any field, in any profession, and at any time in our lives. And it's you're very thoughtful about it.
I also think student journalism, everybody I ever knew, because I didn't do much of it in college, but everyone I did know basically gave up going to class. So I think there's something about running a student newspaper that just is more consuming than just about any professional life would be. But I agree, it's going to be a lot of extra hours. But if you're chewed up by a story, or for my case, it's not so much journalism as like an idea or an essay or something that I write on the side of my regular job. I'll be there on the weekends doing it just because I can't let it go. But I actually think student newspaper are probably harder, because you're voluntary, it's staff's voluntary, and if somebody else gets a football game or doesn't want to show or has an exam, then more falls on you. So I wouldn't write it off just because it's hard now. You know, that's the joke about like the Daily Show. Half of those people are from Harvard, and the Crimson and the Lampoon, and those guys don't go to class. I mean, they pay a lot to go to Harvard, but they're real cutting their teeth on writing every day for the newspaper or for the satire. So, you know, it just depends on what you want to put your priorities on now, but don't write it off.
Well, anything to add? Good. I think I've had it briefly. Let me.
Oh, yeah.
Wow. Oh, that's nice.
Oh, thank you very much.
The best of the best. Is that in frost?
Let me end very quickly. It's kind of wonderful that our three panelists contradicted the essential assumption of the panel that journalism was dying, dead, reporting was gone. All three demonstrated quite the opposite. I want to thank them for that. I want to thank Nick, Kitty, and Al for being here, and especially Al for the stunning week he's put in this residency.
Best of the best.
And let's all take a moment to reflect and honor the real reason we actually came together was the legacy and memory of Gene McCarthy. Thank you very much.